Right now, you are wearing clothes. Maybe a shirt. Maybe something heavier. You probably did not think twice about putting it on this morning. It feels as natural as breathing. But here is something strange. For most of the history of your species, that was not true at all. You think clothing was invented because humans got cold. That is the story you have always been told. It is simple. It is intuitive. And it is almost certainly incomplete. The real story is stranger, older, and far more revealing about what it means to be human. Let us start with the timeline, because the timeline does not match the story you were told. Homo sapiens evolved roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. Warm climates. No need for fur. No need for fabric. For tens of thousands of years, your ancestors lived bodies that were essentially naked by design. Evolution had already solved the temperature problem in a different way. It stripped away most of our body hair and gave us millions of sweat glands instead, an adaptation that let early humans run prey to exhaustion under the brutal African sun. Nakedness was not a flaw to fix. It was the feature that made us such efficient hunters in the first place. So when did clothing actually begin? In 2011, a team of geneticists led by David Reed at the University of Florida took an unusual approach to this question. Instead of digging for ancient fabric, which decomposes and leaves almost no trace, they studied lice. Specifically, the genetic divergence between head lice and body lice. Body lice, it turns out, can only survive in clothing. They evolved separately from head lice at a specific point in time, and that point can be measured through DNA mutation rates. The answer that came back was startling. Somewhere between 170,000 and 83,000 years ago, a population of humans started wearing something regularly enough that an entirely new species of parasite evolved to live in it. That number matters more than it first appears. Modern humans did not migrate out of Africa into colder climates until around 70,000 years ago, maybe a little earlier. Which means clothing existed for tens of thousands of years before anyone needed it for warmth. Before there was any cold to escape. Before there was any biological necessity at all. So why did naked, warm-climate humans start covering their bodies? This is where the story gets interesting, and where most documentaries quietly stop asking questions. Because the honest answer involves something far more complicated than temperature regulation. It involves the invention of shame. Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist who has spent years studying the origins of clothing, has argued that the earliest garments were not functional at all. They were symbolic. Ornamental. Pieces of hide or fiber worn not to survive the elements, but to mark something about the wearer. Status. Group identity. Perhaps even early forms of modesty, tied to an emerging sense of self-consciousness that no other animal on Earth seems to fully share. Think about what that requires. To wear something for symbolic reasons, you need to understand that other people are watching you. You need a theory of mind, the cognitive ability to model what is happening inside someone else's heads. You need to care, on some level, about how you are perceived. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most cognitively demanding leaps in the evolution of human psychology, and clothing may be one of its earliest physical fingerprints. Around the same window of time that clothing appears in the genetic record, something else was happening in human cognition. Symbolic thought was emerging. Ochre pigment use increased. Beads and personal ornamentation appear in the archaeological record. Burial practices became more elaborate. Humans were, for the first time, building an inner world made of meaning, not just survival. Clothing fits directly into that pattern. It was never just fabric. It was one of the first technologies of identity. A way for an individual to say, without speaking a single word, this is who I am, this is my group, this is my status, look at me, or do not look at me, depending on what the moment demanded. There is a researcher named Rebecca Cann, a geneticist whose work on human population genetics intersects with this story in an unexpected way. Her research, alongside others studying the so-called mitochondrial Eve lineage, helped establish the deep African origins of all modern humans. And what that body of research increasingly suggests is that the psychological and social complexity we associate with modern humanity, self-awareness, symbolic thinking, social signaling, emerged earlier and more gradually than scientists once assumed. Clothing was not a late add-on to an already modern mind. It may have been part of the very process that made the modern mind possible. Now here is where it gets even stranger. If early clothing was about identity rather than survival, that means something uncomfortable about a feeling almost every human carries today. The feeling of being inappropriately dressed. The flush of heat across your face when you realize your shirt has a stain in a meeting. The instinct to cover your body in front of strangers, even in a warm room, even when no temperature is at stake. That is not a modern invention. That is not vanity, not in the dismissive sense people usually mean by the word. That is 150,000 years of social signaling, compressed into a single reflex. Psychologists studying self-consciousness today describe something called the spotlight effect, the deeply human tendency to believe other people are paying far more attention to you than they actually are. You walk into a room and feel certain everyone notices the wrinkle in your shirt. They almost never do. But the feeling itself, the felt weight of being seen, is ancient. It may be one of the oldest psychological residues of the same mechanism that first made a human ancestor wrap a piece of hide around their waist, not for warmth, but to be looked at, or to avoid being looked at, in a very specific way. Consider what this means about modesty across human cultures. Every known human society, without exception, has some concept of modesty, some rules around what should and should not be exposed. But here is the strange part. Those rules are wildly different from culture to culture. What counts as immodest in one society is completely unremarkable in another. If clothing were purely about temperature, this variation would make no sense. But if clothing is fundamentally about social meaning, about identity and belonging and status, the variation makes perfect sense. Each culture is not discovering a universal truth about the body. Each culture is writing its own language of symbols onto the same blank canvas every human is born with. And this might be the deepest insight buried in this strange detour through Lice genetics and archaeology. You did not start wearing clothes because you were cold. You started wearing clothes because you became a creature capable of imagining how you appear to others. The moment in human history when fabric first touched skin for non-survival reasons was the moment your ancestors crossed a threshold into a new kind of consciousness, one obsessed not just with staying alive, but with being seen the right way by the people around them. That obsession never left you. It is there when you choose an outfit before a first date. It is there when you change clothes before an important meeting, even though the original outfit would have kept you exactly as warm. It is there in the universal, cross-cultural discomfort of being caught underdressed, overdressed, or simply seen in a way you did not intend. None of that is about temperature. All of it is about the same ancient mechanism, quietly running in the background of nearly every human interaction you will ever have. So tonight, when you take off whatever you are wearing and fold it over a chair, you are not just removing fabric. You are setting down, for a few hours, the oldest and strangest tool your species ever built. A tool that was never really about the cold at all. It was always about being seen.